This is Origin Stories, the Leaky Foundation podcast. I'm Meredith Johnson. Today on the show, we're talking about one of the things that makes humans different from other animals, our hair. From why we have it on the top of our heads instead of all over our bodies, to how we evolved so many variations in color, texture, and curliness. Our guest is Dr. Tina Lasisi. She's an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, where she leads a lab researching the evolution and genetic basis of human variation, with a focus on pigmentation and hair. She's also the host of a PBS show called Why Am I Like This? And she's the recipient of the 2024 Science Communication Award from the Leaky Foundation and the American Association of Biological Anthropologists.
I always frame it as we talk about humans being the naked ape, but actually there are plenty of mammals that are naked. You have mole rats, elephants, depending on how you look at them, and definitely a bunch of mammals that are in the sea. But we're actually the only weirdos that have no fur on our bodies, but decided to keep the fur on our heads mostly. And that's what I emphasize is especially weird about humans and has not been studied enough for my liking.
So when we have something like this that's so different from other animals, what does that tell you as an evolutionary scientist?
So evolution is creative, but also lazy. So if you find a good solution for a problem, you tend to apply it again and again. That's how we have things like convergent evolution of wings. But if you see something that has been evolved once, like scalp hair on a naked body, that really tells you, okay, something must have happened here. Some combination of traits, characteristics for that species and the situation it was in must have been special enough that a new solution had to arise.
What was our situation? And how do you know?
That's a great question. We don't know, but we do a lot of scientifically informed theorizing. Some would call it guessing, but it's a lot more intense. I would say it's a lot more careful work than guessing. So basically, we put together evidence from a lot of different avenues. One of the things that we can do is look at the fossil evidence and understand what species were closest to us and what their evolutionary history was. And what you start seeing is basically the sequence of traits that appears in our lineage. We have this upright posture, we have bipedalism, we have these large brains, and you see that there's this bipedalism that emerges about 2 million years ago when you start seeing Homo erectus. Now, what you see in Homo erectus is this modern day build. They have the same proportions bodily as we do, but the brain size doesn't seem to be quite where it is today in modern humans. And so there's this really interesting, outstanding question in human evolution of, well, why did it take so long? Was there something that was preventing brains from getting to their modern day size? And that's kind of where the hair comes in. And hair and skin are very difficult to think about in terms of human evolution because they don't leave this really nice fossil evidence. So, what we have to do then is infer what makes sense in part using genetics. And what we know from the skin pigmentation side is that there is evidence that the last common ancestors of all humans had darker skin. And what I would love to do is see if we could do a similar thing for hair, but we're not quite there yet because we don't know what genes are involved in hair morphology very well. But what we can do is put together testable evolutionary hypotheses.
Yeah, so you have a hypothesis about why we have hair on the top of our heads and not so much on our bodies. Can you tell us about that and about the research you did and how robots are involved?
How robots are involved. Yes, we will not forget the robots. So basically, what me and my PhD advisor, Nina Jablonski, were wondering is how hair might have a parallel story to skin pigmentation. So Nina did the leading work on the evolution of skin color in relation to vitamin D and UV radiation. So we know that where there's a lot of UV radiation, you benefit from having more pigmentation because it protects the folate in your bloodstream. So the question is, what about hair? Could that help with anything? And we were testing out this hypothesis that tightly coiled hair in particular could reduce the amount of heat you gain specifically from solar radiation. And so I'm going to back up here a little bit because I did talk about humans being very special in terms of having scalp hair on naked bodies. But what's even more exciting, it's the presence of tightly curled hair. And that is not something that you see in any other mammal. And this is something I always say on podcast shows, wherever I'm at. As far as I know, I have not seen any mammal naturally occurring that has tightly coiled hair, anything as close to the tightest coils that you see in humans. If someone finds a mammal that does fit that description, please send me pictures. I'm always open to it. But that adds to this layer of, well, if we were the first ones to have to evolve scalp hair, why were we also the first ones to have to evolve this tightly coiled hair texture? And what we know from research on mammalian coats is that hair offers a lot of protection. So a lot of the discourse that we have in human evolution on hair, hairlessness is, of course, you want to be naked, right? Like if it's hot, you want to be naked. However, there are hairy mammals in very hot places, right? And if it's so beneficial, why would you have mammals in the desert that have hair? And that's because hair can offer protection, especially when it comes to reducing heat gain from solar radiation. And I specify that because you have ambient temperature and solar radiation. It works in a different way. If you're ever outside on a very, very sunny day, what do? You seek shade. And it's significantly cooler when you are in a place where the sun's rays are not hitting you directly. So, what we wanted to do is see if we could find any evidence for that function. And in order to do that, we bought a bunch of human hair wigs and put them on a bunch of robots in climate controlled chambers and turned them on and saw what happened.
That's a very creative solution. So, what were you testing and what happened?
Yeah. So, there are these robots that are very much shaped like the Terminator that are used across many fields to measure the insulation value of various fabrics. And so there are people who use them. So we reasoned, well, you can put a wig on it and basically treat it the same as you would treat a piece of fabric. And so the way a thermal mannequin works is it has a surface that is set to a particular temperature. And in order to keep that set temperature, it needs to pump in energy, electricity. If the external environment is warmer, then it doesn't need to pump in as much electricity. If the external environment is colder, then it needs to pump in more electricity. And so that difference in terms of how much energy is required to keep that stable temperature, that's what tells us about how much insulation a given fabric or wig gives it. And so we had 4 experimental hair conditions: a straight wig, a moderately curled wig, and then a tightly curled wig. And then, of course, we had to have the baseline calibration of no hair. So we also ran all the experiments without hair. And we looked at how heat transfer was affected without solar radiation. And then we simulated solar radiation with floodlights. And what we noticed was an incredible, undeniable effect of not only the presence and absence of hair, but the curlier hair was, the more heat gain was reduced from that solar radiation.
Wow.
It actually got to the point where when we were running these experiments, we were randomizing the sequence in which we were doing them. And so it started out with the tightly curled wig, ran the experiments, and when I ran them with the straight wig, the mannequin was overheating. And so we had to figure out how to change the settings because that's how much of a protective effect tightly coiled hair gave, that we needed to, adjust the experimental settings so that it worked across all of the conditions.
That's amazing. So if curly hair, tightly coiled hair protects from solar radiation so well, like why doesn't every human have curly hair? How did we end up with so many different kinds?
That's one of the big things that makes evolution so complicated. If there is a trait that is good, then why doesn't everyone have that trait? And the reason is that this trait may not always be under selection. So let's take skin color, for example. Um, when you look at skin color around the world, mostly, yes, it does adhere to this pattern of where there is more UV radiation, skin is darker, and where there's less UV radiation, skin is lighter. But especially once you go into the Americas, you see that that doesn't hold as well anymore. And our understanding of this is that there hasn't been as much time for that trait to be under selection. So, how much does having this trait or not having this trait affect your ability to produce surviving offspring? Now, when it comes to hair, the pattern doesn't seem to hold at all, does it? Right? There are many places that have a lot of solar radiation where people have straight, maybe wavy hair. If you look across South Asia, for example, and my thinking around this is that this may have been an important point of selection early on in human evolution. So going back to Homo erectus, 1.8 to 1.5 million years ago, after we're fully bipedal, fully naked in the sun, but like brains are not quite the size that they were yet, maybe tightly curled hair represented a solution to release that constraint. So brains are very heat sensitive and they also generate heat. The bigger your brain is, the more dire your situation is going to be, right? So it's very plausible that it may have been the case that humans evolved this tightly coiled hair, which was able to minimize how much heat they were gaining, minimize how much water they were losing, and now it was viable to have a large brain. But the thing is, once you have this large brain, you come up with solutions. And in much the same way as many people who turn red on the beach do not have to suffer if they have sunscreen, there may have been other shade seeking behavior or other behavioral adaptations.
Okay, is there a difference between hair and fur? Is it the same thing?
Mhm. Hair and fur are exactly the same thing. Humans like to make ourselves special by using different words for us. And also, it's a pet peeve of mine because people talk about it with dogs as well. My dog, I have a poodle, is right is right next to me right now. So a lot of people will talk about, oh well, this breed of dog doesn't have fur, they have hair. And a lot of times when I ask people, well, what do you mean by that? They're talking about how the hair is finer, but you have thick hair. Like you can have thick hair fibers, thin hair fibers. The hair follicle is this incredible, honestly, a super mini organ because unlike many of our other tissues or the organs that develop once and then you're set and, hopefully you don't have to lose them for the rest of your life. Hair follicles go through a growth phase, a resting phase, and then they completely miniaturize and regenerate a whole new hair follicle. So that entire cycle is the regeneration of an entire mini organ, and there is a supply of stem cells there that helps with that regeneration of the hair follicle each time. And going through that process, you have asynchrony between our hair fibers, right? So our hair fibers grow for anywhere between a couple of weeks, if you're talking about our eyebrows or our eyelashes, to a couple of months, maybe, depending on what kind of body hair you have, to 2 to 7 years if you're talking about scalp hair. I've even heard like 10 years. So you have hair that is growing for that long. But it's not all synchronized because if it was, then every however many years or weeks, all of it would fall out. But you can have synchronization, and that's some stuff that we see across different mammals, especially when you're thinking about seasonal coats. That's the synchronization of different types of hair follicles falling, shedding at different times and regenerating at other times, which again, I think hair is awesome. It's super cool.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I guess I mean, I think about eyebrows, like you do, but I never considered that what if they grew like our head hair and just
Mhm.
like kept going.
And they do once you become an emeritus professor, I just wanna specify.
Yeah, and our hair like changes over our lifetimes. It changes color. Some people lose their hair.
Mhm. Yes, and going through puberty and going through chemotherapy, for example, can change its texture. So that's something that I get questions about all the time, and honestly, it's the next thing I think I'm gonna focus on because, that to me is very exciting.
Yeah, and you mentioned that we're the only animals that have this kind of tight curly hair pattern, but then a lot of people will say, "Well, what about
Mhm.
poodles?" Which you have right next to you. And then when Ray and I were doing our research, we found all these cute, cute, cute pictures of tiny baby gorillas in the mist with their curly hair.
They're so cute. They're so cute.
I love them so much.
Yes, absolutely. But let's dig into that. So, funnily enough, see, this is how I know I'm in an anthro crowd because y'all will bring up the gorillas before the sheep, which is usually what people do, right? People will be like, "Oh, what about sheep?" So, sheep have wool, right? Wool is also hair. Wool, fur, hair, it's all the same thing. And one of the misnomers of tightly coiled human hair is woolly, right? Like, oh, you have woolly hair. And that connection between wool and tightly coiled hair that has definitely some racist roots, but even that aside, it confuses people and it makes sense why nobody looked at this until I did and my advisor thought to look at it because they were thinking, well, wool keeps you hot. So if you have tightly coiled hair, that's like wool, it must be hot. But those are two very different structures. So wool has a bilateral wave. And we actually know the process that is occurring in order to create that bilateral wave because wool is an industry and it has money and you need to understand it. And so we have spent so many years looking at what the process is there and we actually understand it really well. And when people tried to look for that same process in humans, they did not find those in humans. And if you pay attention to human hair, you'll note that curls are helical. They're not waves, right? Like human hair coils, it curls. Now, poodles, that's easy. There's a lot of weird dogs. Domesticated animals, not to make them not count, but we can make a lot happen. So I would argue, and this is me even looking at my dog, even if I see some things that are approaching a coil, even though I would say a lot of what I see is this bilateral waving, it's not the same structure as human hair curl. And this is not me being pedantic, but after having done the experimentation, there actually is a really significant functional difference. If you have a bunch of especially very thin hairs that are lining up very closely together, you have a lot of density, right? A lot of hair fibers packed closely together. That's not good if you want to be losing heat versus human coils are this chaotic lattice of coils where you have a lot of airspace, a lot of empty space in between, and that's what allows us to have this incredible absence of a trade-off, which there usually is with hair, of we can reduce how much heat is coming down from the radiation, but we can also maximize how much heat we're losing. That's not the case with wool for sure, because that stacks up like perfectly with dogs like Winston, my poodle. That's not the case either. You have like all of this density. There's like no airspace in the hair. And with gorillas, well, I'm going to need a gorilla hair sample. But from the pictures that I saw, it doesn't appear to be as tightly coiled as human hair. And I would add to that I'm starting to think that there is a lower density of hair when I look at human hair curls, right? It's like not as closely packed together, but that's still something that we're having to explore.
And a lot of your work has sort of defined what our curls are, right? You've
Mhm.
come up with ways to talk about more precisely. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So any trait that you want to study, you have to operationalize. And that means you are defining it in a very specific way. And I try to be very careful when I talk about it, but it's especially evident in the way that I measured hair. I spent a lot of time, literally over a decade of my life, trying to figure out how best to measure hair curl, because there is a lot that is captured within the concept of hair texture. And when we're talking about hair shape, we're talking about a lot of things combined together.
This must be such an exciting area of study because there's still so many questions to answer.
Yes, I'm very still after all these years, I'm very excited. Otherwise I would not be here.
So we have some more questions, and I was wondering if I could ask Ray to come on because he has a hair care hairstyle related question.
Hi, Meredith. Hi, Tina.
Hi, Ray.
Hi, Ray.
So, when we were getting ready for this, we both heard you say a bunch of different times in different places, like, so much of research is me search. And as you can see, I have curly hair. And I usually don't let it get this long because I've always been under the impression that also because my hair is black,
Mhm.
it gets really hot in the summer. Like, it just like holds all of this heat on my head because it's absorbing all the sun rays, and then like I'm sweating. And so I was kind of blown away by the finding that maybe I might be better off with some curly hair in the summer versus like just like slathering my like bald head in a lot of sunscreen every day. And so I guess maybe this is like a Dear Tina question, but like, would I be better off in the summer with my curly hair versus no hair?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for offering to extend our research. I'm really excited about this partnership. We're going to do good work together. Yes, trust me on this. Even if you leave your hair to what it is now, if you want to grow it out more, that also works. Um, Stand in the sun and see how you feel, and look at the difference if you can, like even just touching it, in temperature between your scalp and then the top of your hair. And here's another fun anecdote. Like 10 years ago or something, I was outside somewhere with a friend who had very straight light hair that laid very flat on his head, and he like touched the top of my hair consensually. Always ask if you want to touch someone else's hair. And he was like, ow, like, he burned his hand. He was like, oh, it's so hot, like, are you not hot? And I didn't feel anything, but the top of my hair, not the head, top of my hair was really hot. And yes, it does absorb that heat. But again, this is one of the peculiarities of how radiative heat works. We have seen this in mammals. There are really interesting studies from the 80s, I want to say, like from the 70s through the 90s, of various uh mammals. They were looking at their coats and looking at the effect of color, because everyone has this idea of like, well, you must be better off having lighter hair and less hair if you're somewhere where there's a lot of solar radiation, right? Because like it should reflect the light. But it turns out that in practice, it's not how it works. There's this idea of dark objects heat up, light objects reflect light is so misapplied. And we even see this all the way from people thinking that, well, people with dark skin, like they must be in so much trouble in the sun because black objects heat up, right? Meanwhile, black people are fine. And some people are turning into lobsters. So what happens is that you don't have these flat surfaces like what we usually think about when we're measuring this like reflectance and absorbance of heat. Now, when it comes to hair specifically, especially if you have these fibers that are pointing in all these directions, the straight radiation of the sun bounces off. It gets absorbed, but your hair is not living tissue. So if it gets absorbed by the top of your hair and it bounces off some of it, that's great. Meanwhile, if you have straight hair that is flat against your scalp, there is no distance between the top of your hair and the top of your scalp. And that's something that we see in that mammalian literature, that they say that once you have over 2 inches of fur, hair, coat color doesn't matter anymore. Coat color doesn't make a difference in how much you heat up or don't, because it's that distance from the skin that matters the most. And if you have light hair on top of that, yes, you have this reflection, but it's not necessarily going to bounce off. It's going to bounce around your hair and probably hit your scalp. So having it absorb in the melanin that is kept in your dead hair shaft that is there to protect you is much better than it coming down to your living scalp. So I expect a full report by the end of the summer. Thank
Okay, I feel really emboldened
you.
to keep my hair over the summer. Thank you so much, Tina.
Thank you, Ray.
Back to you, Meredith.
Okay.
So how did you first get interested in studying hair from an evolutionary perspective?
So it all started with a lecture on human skin color variation and how it relates to UV radiation, and just seeing those maps of the distribution of skin color and the distribution of UV radiation was such a eureka moment for me that I was just so impressed at such an elegant explanation. I had never thought about evolution in that way. And going back to the whole research is me search, the way my 20 something year old brain processed it was like, cool, now I know why my skin is brown. Why is my hair curly? And that didn't have a satisfactory answer. And so I was like a dog with a bone clenched between my jaws, and I needed to get my answer. And here I am, over a decade later, still trying to get this answer.
And that's really cool that you were able to join Nina's lab and study with her, like the person that
Yeah.
did that elegant research about skin color variation and vitamin D. That's so cool.
Yeah, it was incredible. And especially because I actually wasn't intending to be a biological anthropologist. I did my undergrad at the University of Cambridge, where they taught it as a three field: cultural anthropology, or social anthropology, as they call it over there, archaeology, and biological anthropology. And I was so sure I wanted to do cultural. And it wasn't until this lecture that I had entertained the idea of doing biology. And if it wasn't for my undergraduate mentor at the time, I wouldn't have gone down this path. It very much wasn't a strategic plan or the result of a lifelong, at that point, interest in something, but more, hey, this is kind of cool. And getting the kind of encouragement that I got of, you can do this, was instrumental to me feeling like I could. And so I really tried to pay this forward now, because I noticed that when I talk about my research, it's really intelligible to people. They're like, oh, yeah, no, that makes sense to me that you would ask that question. I also have questions. And I want to tell people, I'm like, your questions are good. You have good questions. In case no one has told you this, your questions are awesome. And like, I might be the first person to entertain the idea that they are having really good questions.
Yes, and we love that.
Mhm.
And it feels like such a new area of study. So you have the opportunity to do like a lot of foundational work, and that's pretty exciting.
I mean, I can see how from the outside it might seem this way. To be honest, like, being in it, I don't know, like it doesn't feel fun. That's not to say that it isn't, but when something's in front of you and you're doing it, you're like, yeah, I know, I'm just doing it. And hopefully over the years, over the decades, it'll accumulate to something that is very valuable. And I mean, I really, one of my biggest inspirations is my former advisor Nina Jablonski, because I remember when I was younger, nobody knew what melanin was. That's not a word that people used. And now there's literally melanin merch you can get on Instagram. We're living in a different world. And I think most of us couldn't imagine a world now where not only did we not know what melanin was, but maybe even believed that dark skin had no benefit in solar radiation.
Yeah. How do you think the evolutionary perspective of this topic benefits people or
So I would say one of the things that's really interesting about having done the work that I've done is that, yes, within biological anthropology, and let's say anthropology generally, but especially biological anthropology, I'm weird. I stand out because I work on hair. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? Like, dermatology is a thing. And so I could not possibly claim to be the first person to have ever thought about it, right? But what you see is this really interesting conundrum of, well, why do people who work on hair look at it so differently. And that's really where just the benefit of coming up academically, intellectually, in an evolutionary anthropology environment, it shapes the way you look at the world. It shapes the way that you ask questions. And, no one would argue that there are incredible benefits to thinking directly about how can you make certain hair care products to make hair do certain kinds of things? How can you fix various issues that people have with their hair and skin from a medical perspective? There's a need for basic scientific research to be funded, which absolutely includes evolutionary biology, evolutionary anthropology work, because I'm looking at just this tiny piece of something and saying, how does this thing work? How does this thing, humans, work? What are all of the fundamental processes and structures that affect us? And that gives you power in that it allows you to make sense of things, how they fit together, and in a lot of ways allows you to predict, right? And that is really what we're seeing with the research that's been done on skin color, knowing that there would have been some kind of selection in both directions allows us to then say, okay, well, what would that thing have been? We know that it has to be something that probably influences fitness, the birth of offspring. Folate is really important. And being able to put all those things together, you now have this incredible scaffolding for being able to personalize and even think about how these things are affecting different people. Like if you have darker skin in a place that does not have a lot of solar radiation, just because you don't have rickets, just because you're not bow-legged, doesn't mean that you may not have a vitamin D deficiency that might affect you so significantly that 2 million years ago, it would have meant that your offspring wouldn't have survived at the same rates as people with lighter skin. And the same thing can be said of, what we're learning now about like folate and what it has to do with pregnancy and how it travels through the bloodstream. Just all of this stuff is incredibly useful and interesting. And a lot of the money and how it flows would make you think that it's superfluous research that's very just like useless. And it is so important to be able to tell the difference between things that have direct application versus things that are useful, and they can be different.
Yeah. I mean, and, I work for the Leaky Foundation, so we obviously know this type of basic research is so important for understanding who we are and why we are the way we are and, how it all happened. So, do you have a closing thought that you'd like to share to wrap up our interview then so you can go?
It's like holding me hostage until I say something interesting. Just kidding. So what I will say is I just opened my lab at the University of Michigan. The actual physical lab space is still being built, but it should be done by this summer. And I've taken on a couple of students and we're working on some really interesting stuff. And one of the things I wanted to talk about especially is some of the work that I'm starting to do with my student, Sarah Taylor. We're really interested in sexual dichromatism and natal coats in non-human primates across the primate order, because that's another dimension of hair morphology that we kind of touched on in the beginning of how it changes over time and different parts of your body. Well, one aspect of that is this dimension of variation that sex gives us, right? Sex is this dynamic thing that changes over time. You go through puberty, and depending on what receptors you have in different places, different parts of your body are going to respond differently to hormones being there. And so what we're trying to understand now is how do sex hormones interact with hair follicles to create differences in hair growth, but also differences in hair color. So watch out for that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your work and all this interesting information about hair.
Thank you for having me.
You can learn more about Tina Lasisi and her work on her website, tinalasisi.com. We have that link and more in your show notes. Origin Stories is a project of the Leaky Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to funding human origins research and sharing discoveries. You can support this show by going to leakyfoundation.org/origin stories and clicking the Origin Stories donate button. Your donation will be quadruple matched thanks to Jeannie Newman and the Anna Gordon Getty Foundation, so you can turn $10 into $40 to support the show. Support for Origin Stories comes from listeners like you, with additional support from the Anna Gordon Getty Foundation, Camilla and George Smith, Jeannie Newman, and the Joan and Arnold Travis Education Fund. This episode was produced by Ray Pang. Our editor is Audrey Quinn. Theme music by Henry Nagel and additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.